everybody, and welcome back to the DM's Book Club, a motley collection of tales and guides that we're throwing at you to help improve your GMing, which I always get confused with DMing, which is, what is it? GM is the non-D&D equivalent, right? The General Master.
Essentially, yeah.
Yes,
Game
exactly.
Master, General Masters.
Precisely. My name is Ryan, and I frequently get stuck with acronyms, confusing myself with everything from what DM and GM means and everything else we've ever done in terms of topics. And here with me, putting up with me, is Fiona. Hello.
Hello. Putting up with you is a strong word. I think we're above colleagues now. I think we're okay.
Do you? That's great. That's
wonderful. You don't. Okay.
What have you been up to this week?
This week, it's been amazing. I've been on holiday. This is me recording in the past, so the future. I bet it went brilliantly. I had a great time, and I stayed inside, so it was all good.
Brilliant. Stayed inside, kept safe. Future Fiona had a whale of a time. Yeah, very similar actually. It's been a funny old few months, isn't it? But we're all keeping ourselves busy and recording podcasts, because what else are you going to do in your time? With all of this lovely free time that you've had, what have you been reading? What are you going to tell me about today?
Well, Ryan, as I sort of hinted to last time, I don't know how people do this, because D&D, we've always said, is basically a role-playing version of a video game. It's mostly combat heavy, and it's all about that. And one of the real things I think I know I struggle with, and I wonder if new DMs struggle with it, is running combat. I feel like
running a combat. That's quite good.
I think the thing is, because it's very exciting when you're a player and you're like, oh, here's the big bad, and you're going to do this and do this, and that's very exciting. But when you're doing what I call the admin side of it, and you're making sure that it's like what they call like stage manager, you're like, and cue hobgoblin and cue the dragon, and then all these things going on when you've got lair actions and all this sort of thing. It's actually, I feel it's one of the most boring things to do, but it's one I mess up all the time. So I thought, why not have a see what the Dungeon Master's Guide says? And it turns out there's actually a few different ways to run combat, which I didn't realize. So I thought we'd talk about it today and talk about admin. Hooray.
Admin, it's the most fun part of combat. And so we're specifically going to be talking about some of the optional combat rules from a Dungeon Master's Guide from page 247. He's frantically looking at his book and checking he's read the right bit. So
we'll find out.
Mentioned before, one of the things you find particularly enjoyable is keeping track of the admin of combat, and specifically initiative. So tell me a bit about initiative and how it works and what you're going to bring to the table.
Absolutely. So in case people haven't played D&D or are not too sure, essentially when you go into combat, the DM will ask you to roll initiative, and that's rolling your D20 and usually adding your initiative modifier, or technically your dexterity modifier, and the person with the highest dexterity modifier or the highest initiative will usually go first. It basically means who is the quickest to react to a situation which is very quickly going south, I like to think. So usually it is people who are a bit quicker on the draw, or, usually you've got your monks and your rogues, etc. Sometimes it's just very lucky. You might get advantage on initiative and stuff and roll twice and get the highest number. And usually we've played it sort of like if you and another player or another creature tie for initiative, so you get the same result, it's usually the person that has the highest dexterity modifier or initiative modifier to go first, because they're just slightly a little bit quicker than the other person. But that's essentially it. When you go into combat, that is what you roll, and that dictates the order in which players go in. So you have what essentially the round, essentially, and each round is in real time 6 seconds, and each player has their turn essentially, and you'll go through. Say you've got like 3 players and 2 bad guys or bad people, and you could just go through that order, and once they get to the end of the round, you start again from the top and go down as well. And that is genuinely what all the lists talk about, in the sense of like what order people go in, how did they react. It usually is a set order. It's always going to be this person first because they rolled the highest, and then followed by this and this. And you might change a little bit. There might be 2 rounds in, another mob of bad people sort of come in and start attacking you from another side. Maybe there's a lair action. Maybe there's like at the top of each round and you have to make a save, etc. And have the environment attack you as well, which is always my downfall in any situation. Like, damn it, I forgot the floor can betray you.
Never trust the floor.
Never trust the floor.
Basically just a long, like a schedule, effectively, like an order of service where if you just keep going in a list, it starts from the top, go to the bottom, and then start from the top again. again. Everyone has an order. It's a logic. Otherwise, I mean, I've seen combat done before without initiative, and it can be very difficult to make sure that everybody has a go. Everyone gets an equal weight in terms of like what they want to do. It can get very chaotic. So it's effectively trying to put structure into something totally imaginary.
And actually, that's a very good point as well. Like sometimes, if you're maybe not as confident in your abilities as a player, or you're just like maybe a bit more sort of, you have more of a quiet voice. Sometimes, if there's no structure at all, you might not go at all, and you have sort of people speaking over you and stuff. At least with this sort of system, you get your chance to do something. And it might be attacking the creature, it might be running away, it might be hiding, it might be trying to figure out something in the heat of the battle, whatever it is in that 6 turns. And in case, again, people aren't aware, when you are a player, you have sort of 3 things you can do. You can move, so you can move up to your movement anywhere within range. It might be a check depending on if it's difficult terrain or not. You have your action, which is usually attacking the creature or doing a spell or doing anything like that. And then your bonus action is something quick, whether that's I guess it's like sheathing or unsheathing a weapon. In some games, obviously, it's bonus action to take a healing potion yourself. I know that's a rule that is usually an action in the DM's guide, but I think most players are now like, nah, it's bonus action because it's a lot easier. And there's also something called a free action where you could just speak aloud or do something that's not necessarily impactful on battle, but maybe alerts other people or something else that's not necessarily falls within those 3 categories as well, I'd say.
Lots of stuff that you can do, and it just is, as I say, you keep doing the rounds over and over and over and over until there's some sort of resolution. One of the problems of initiative is that it's not that it's fixed, but your dexterity kind of gets put down and you roll, and it's the same sort of way every time. So yeah. Tell me some other ways you can do initiative. What's the sort of the plan of attack here?
So the traditional sort of way, it talks about 3 big ways in the combat section of the book. It talks about a hidden list, a visible list, and index cards. And most people, I think, will be aware of hidden lists. So it is what you said, you roll your d20, you add your dex modifier, you are put in an order that's usually in an Excel spreadsheet or on a piece of paper, and then you go from each turn. But the players don't necessarily know what's coming up next. They'll be able to work it out maybe 2 or 3 rounds into it, going, okay, I think Aubrey goes first and then I can go, etc. You don't necessarily know how injured a creature is. For example, you can ask for descriptions and stuff, if they look bloodied or if they look like they're about to flee and stuff like that, but you don't know what they're going to do per se. The only thing with that is that, again, it's mostly up to the DM for admin side going, okay, you're next. And it's easy to forget because obviously in the heat of battle, you're like, okay, running around and then trying to not only take the damage, account for any lair actions or any silly things that the players have done, because we always do silly things in initiatives. Mm-hmm. It's very easy to forget someone's turn if you're caught up in sort of the excitement of the battle. Like I've definitely forgotten my turn because I've been just excited to see what other people are doing, and then it's like, oh, I'm so sorry. Well, you can have your turn now, and that again could influence the battle as well. So that's sort of the main one I think most people use are hidden lists. Then you've got visible lists, which is essentially the same thing, but it describes it as having like a whiteboard somewhere and giving another player in charge of it so that they can write down visibly, okay, it's this person, then the big bad, then the environment, etc. And so everyone can see where they are, but it does remove that element of surprise. It's like, okay, the lair action's up next. And it then does encourage players, understandably, I think, to metagame slightly, go, okay, this person goes next. If you hold your action, I can do X, Y, Z, and then you can go, and it's one of those things, again, in a video game, when you're playing, say, Final Fantasy VII or anything like that, you can have your party and you go, okay, well, if they go first, then I can do this, and it maximizes the amount of damage. And I think if that's the sort of game you want to play, if you really want to work out all of those ways of doing it, good for you. I prefer being on the back foot quite a lot, and it happens to me a lot when I do other games and improv and stuff. I actually like being challenged to try and think of something on my feet, because there's always the default actions I can do, absolutely, but actually be going, ooh, okay, this is something new. I'm going to have to completely rethink how I'm going to act this scene, and how would I keep it true to the character? How would I keep it true to my reaction, etc., without necessarily going, oh, that's that's really important. We need to deal with that right now. Those are the two main sort of ways that you had like a list thing. The other way, which it talks about, which actually I've only ever seen my fiance Jacob use, is index cards, where again it is a list, but everyone rolls stuff, and then you just put their names on index cards, and you just go through the order. And as soon as someone's done or is finishing their turn, you just put the index card to the bottom of the pile, and then it has the stats of the big bad or whoever is on the card. And that works quite well as well. Like it was interesting to see that actually in play, because then they don't necessarily know who is up next, but at least then you have a tracker of who is next currently. The only issue is that you need to remember to move the card forward, otherwise you can get stuck in stuff. Yeah.
And there are advantages and disadvantages to each one. Like I like the idea of giving players responsibility for doing some of the initiative, because as a DM, it takes a lot of effort and multitasking off you at the expense of giving them more information than they would normally have on an initiative thing. And it's all about avoiding, well, no, not necessarily, but sometimes it's all about avoiding metagaming and sort of being beyond the game. Other people don't mind that at all, and they like to sort of play it in that way. I always think with index cards, how would you end up putting surprise monsters in or sort of throwing things into it? Would you just have to remember where it was in the index cards and throw new cards in as you're going through? I guess is a way of doing it.
I guess you maybe already have the stack ready to go, and as soon as you get to go, not till round 2 or whatever, and then just have to remember when the round is coming up, I guess. But I agree, like it's like, again, is that something where you have to be really on it to be like, okay, this now monster comes in, it gets slotted. Maybe they only get slotted at the end of the round or at the beginning of the round rather than halfway through, which can be, again, depends on what kind of creature it is. It doesn't necessarily give that same surprise. It's like, okay, it's a new round. Oh, look, more people have joined us. Who knew, So I definitely see that.
So we're going to jump wildly to another part of the Dungeon Master's Guide, which is page 270. But when we talk about initiative, there's different ways you can even then spice up, not just the tracking of initiative, but also like giving more variance about how it works. And some of these seem mad. So we've been talking about what I would call traditional initiative, where you just roll D20 plus your dex. That's your number. Tell me about some other ways you can do it.
The first option is just have your initiative score. Have 10 plus your initiative score, and you just do that.
So like a passive check, like you would do for passive perception, or
exactly. So again, that could screw over people who don't have necessarily good initiative, but then you always have the set way things are going. So obviously some creatures move slower than others, so certainly the big bads maybe go much later in the turn than you expect. I think again it just makes it for ease, because obviously it's like, well, no one needs to roll dice they don't want to, but fun fact that everyone loves rolling dice, I guess. And that chance to be able to like, oh wow, I actually go first, and then have the panic of going, oh god, I'm going first, what do I do, and stuff like that. But that is a really good way of just streamlining it completely, just having 10 plus your dex or your initiative modifier. It then talks about something called side initiative, which I think both you and I have seen in play. Now, this was about a year and a bit ago, I think, but we went to see a production called Adventurers Wanted, which essentially is a live performance of D&D on stage, a bit like when you see streaming and stuff. But what the DM did, they said, for ease, we're just going to toss a coin, and it's going to be the players versus the audience. It's going to be side initiative. And that means that whoever has the highest dex or whoever wins the coin toss, they will go first, and then it will go through that team, essentially, until the end, and then the other team gets to go. And it's just literally a game of two sides, and that's very good. It's very easy to watch for streaming purposes, because then you're not having these rolls and you're not having people shout out random numbers and then the awkward 30 seconds when we're all writing down, etc., what the order is. You just know that, okay, it's my team's go. At some point I will have a go. And I would say on top of that, I ran a game of Pugmire, which is like a D&D fantasy variant which involves dogs, of course.
So for a second I thought it was some sort of dystopian, like criminal cyber thing. No, pugs. That's not where I thought that was going.
They've also got a secondary book called Monarchies of Mal, which is about cats. But their initiatives, it's the same. Like, it's the highest dex goes first, but then that character picks who goes next. And then you go down to the end of the round, and then whoever's last can choose to go again, starting the new round, so they get 2 turns in a row, or they can choose someone else. And what it naturally says in the book is, well, you know, it makes sense that you would pick someone in your own party. So then if the good guys go first, they get to pick all their players in a certain order, and then goes all the bad people, and so on and so forth. But then you might need to think about it tactically. Well, one of us should go last in the turn so that we get a double attack, essentially. And that was interesting to role play, actually, and play out, because suddenly you're not sure what order you're going in anymore, but you can plan it a little bit, going, okay, I'm going to choose the ranger to go next to fire into things, and then they were like, oh, but then I want the big bad to go, and then with the warlock can finish it off, that sort of thing. So that's a bit more of an organic, fluid thing, this sort of side initiative, which I quite like. The downside to that, obviously, is that people can just team up on one enemy, and then the enemy never gets to go because they're already dead before their turn comes up.
Yeah, if you've got one entire side moving and then the other side, you've got all of your players who can use all their abilities, all their spells, and before you know it, the other side is totally dead before they even get to move. It's very extreme. And I guess if you were a player on the receiving end of it and all the monsters got to all move first and 2 of you were unconscious before you got to act, I could see that also not being the most fun that you could have on a day.
Interestingly, Pugmire does go away to to stop this. So there's a bowl of fortune where you put tokens in. Basically, it's an inspiration, a font of inspiration. And if the dogs or the adventurers play to their traits, etc., or do something you think is really cool, you add to the font. And what you can do, you can interrupt a turn, essentially. I can choose a big bag to go next. One of the players can be like, no, I take a token from the pool and I interrupt the turn. Obviously, they can only do that so many times depending on how many tokens are in there, but as a DM, you would add to the thing every time you wanted to interrupt the order, and the players can take from when they want to interrupt the order. And that actually worked quite well, because you could then interrupt the flow quite easily, but you couldn't do it all the time. I think it's a give and take, because you could, as a DM, you could be really harsh and just add loads of tokens for one round and keep interrupting the players go, knowing that it could be like a really cool cinematic moment where they all turn and they go, no, we will not die this day, and then take all the tokens and then interrupt any turn you had on the way over. So that's one way of doing it.
Really cool. I like that font idea. Like, I've never thought about doing that, but it's like a sort of shared inspiration pool. We played was it like a Star Wars version where it had a similar sort of feel, like a sort of the force in the area being sort of pulled and pushed.
Story points. It's either story points or destiny points. There you go. Yes, destiny points.
Yeah. So what if these options are far too generic and sort of easy to use? What if we had something that was incredibly complicated and very, very statsy? Could you think of anything that we could use?
Ryan, wow, you were right on the money. I will get to that page. I was not prepared, but yes.
I like to throw these things.
You do.
I read this idea, and I thought, oh my God, trying to do this in practice would be ridiculous.
I feel like someone at Wizards, they're like, we need more options for combat. What can we do? And someone said, why don't this? I would be very interested to see if anyone does this particular one, but I'll describe it as, it's called Speed Factor. And basically it is using their knowledge of the initiative order to influence their decisions. It can get to the point where they're metagaming, or they're getting too prepared and it's predictable. So why don't we just have more uncertainty at the cost of speed? So everyone basically says what their action is, and depending on whether it's a spell, whether it's attacking at certain points using a two-handed weapon or one-handed weapon, you get a minus to your initiative modifier. And once everyone has said what they're doing, they roll the d20, and then you work out the order going down from, it's like a countdown from 30, and then people's actions go off when the numbers are hit. But the crux of this is that you have to do that action or lose your turn entirely. You cannot change halfway through, because the idea is that these things like casting a spell does take time. Like it says, for spell casting, you subtract the spell's level. So if you're going to cast like a level 6 spell, that's a -6 to your initiative. And that can be quite effective if you're going to do, I don't know, like a fireball or anything like that. But other people have gone first and maybe rushed in and then got stuck or anything like that. You have to do that spell or you lose your turn and the spell slot as well. And I was like, wow, it's a lot. And I just, It sounds awful.
It sounds very, very intense in terms of just the amount of rolling you've got to do. Because in this, you have to roll every turn in secret. So if you decide to, as I say, like you've got a paladin, you've got +0 to dexterity, but you have a heavy weapon and you're planning on casting a spell as well, then you would roll every turn. And yeah, I could imagine maybe a lot of wasted turns using this tactic. Like if you had cast a level 5 spell and your target is dead before the roll comes around and you can't use it anymore, like that's harsh. Do you say, well, you have to cast the spell, or do you say, oh, well, I'll let you get away with a cantrip then instead? Like you'd have to do a lot of house rolls to make this work, I feel. But equally, I'd love to give it a go, because I reckon it would be very strange as to like whether people would go, you know what, I am actually going to carry loads of light weapons around now, or I'm going to have a halfling because they get more of initiative modifier than someone else. Like that's, I can see this being really fun.
Yeah, so that's the thing. There's 2 separate tables, one for the factors, so like what is your action in the combat itself per turn. But yeah, creature size as well. Like a tiny creature will get a +5 to initiative, because obviously you're thinking like small, what are they called now? I've completely, it's like whatever the imps are that fly around on wings. I think they're just called imps. They're going to be really quick, and they're going to just attack you. Any swarms of creature will be very quick as well. And it's just, it's just one of those things where it'd be cool to try. I think it would be one of those things which you would do maybe in a one shot of just one encounter, so like a battle royale or something like that, and try it out. But it's going to take, I think, for every hour you play of a combat, and let's face it, combats go on for quite a long time. It's not necessarily as quick as we say.
They really can, yeah.
Can you imagine an hour? But it's going to, I think it would go up to maybe 3 hours, just making sure the rolls go right and getting people used to the idea that you roll in secret and then you act. It'll be quite exciting, I think. But God, running it, I think I would lose the will to live, I think, by round 2. And be like, no, forget this.
I think that's fair. Yeah, absolutely. It's a very, very admin heavy version of it, but I guess it does scratch that itch if you want something that's more reactive to what people are doing and doesn't require more averagey sort of stats that can just sort of fix an order in. Like if you don't know what the initiative order is going to be from turn to turn, I could imagine that would be very different as to how you would plan a combat. Like if you know you're going up next, you can metagame it. If you don't know when you're going, then I can see that being very, very confusing in terms of thought process and deciding what you want to do.
And I think it brings on to a good point, I think, because a lot of people, like I said, when you think of D&D, it does feel like a video game in certain aspects, certainly like the way combat is streamlined, that you have a certain amount of time to do certain things, and everything costs an action or a bonus action, etc. And I don't know, I feel like me as a player, what I try and do, I try and react, if someone shouts out, hit the person, I'm like, okay, they shouted it out, so that's fine. I don't necessarily know if that person's going to use a fireball or use any of these things unless they're going to go, you get out the way, I'm about to use fireball, which is obviously very clunky exposition, or being used to, they're going to do hypnotic pattern or anything like that. So I think, especially with one shots, I don't know, I try my best not to metagame. And certainly, and we've talked about this before, when you see a creature and you recognize what it is, or there's a magic item, and I know I react, I go, oh, that's really cool, but I always try and like keep silent and just like, you know what, let this play out, because it's more fun for people to work out what it is or to role play it in a certain way. And I feel the same in combat as well. Like I know, and I say this as someone who's taken a very basic character and just has 3 moves, and I forget one of the moves all the time. But at least I feel like then I know by default I will always fall back on these moves, but then if something else happens, I can factor that in. Whereas I feel like with spellcasters, certainly you have so many options, but obviously if you stack it in a certain way, then you just, it gets to a point where you need to know maximizing it. Certainly if you're playing a class like Rogue, which depends on like sneaking in, having advantage and stuff, you really need to be aware what other people are doing. And I feel like I maybe wouldn't be able to play a Rogue as well, because I think I'd be asking like, what are you doing next? Because then I'll do this, even though Rogues tend to go first anyway, because they've got ridiculously high decks. So
yeah, exactly. And there would be some very interesting ways of having to sort of track it and think about it differently to how we're used to doing it. Like, I think heavy spellcasters with really high spell levels could be atrociously difficult to use. Like, I could just see that being an absolute nightmare. Got not just initiative, there's loads of things in this chapter talking about ways that a dungeon master can deal with stats and how the game works and how combat works and different sort of variants. We obviously have spoken about initiative quite a lot, but there's a lot about hit points and sort of conditions and average damage. I mean, tell us a little bit about that sort of thing.
Again, this is another thing where, and I will say this, a lot of this book does talk about using maps and miniatures and stuff, which again depends on that sort of play. Obviously, we've used maps and miniatures when we played in real life, and a lot of people use it when they play like on Roll20 or any other sort of tabletop simulator to simulate a war game, because again, like I said, like it is essentially a game where if you map it out, then you can maybe see options that you weren't aware of due to sort of the way things have been described. So I will say, obviously, like there's a whole bit about like how hexes and squares work, which instantly was like, I don't care about. I know they're different shapes. That's as far as I got. But improvised damage is an interesting thing because again, these things happen all the time where you're on the battlements and there's a siege going on, and you go, oh, I'm just going to take a brazier and just fling it at the creature that's coming up a ladder. It's like, well, what do you do for damage and stuff like that? And they've got, a nice little table about like, improvising damage is like, if it's something very small, like, burning coals or like, it says like hit by a falling bookcase. I'd love to know what one shot that came up in. That you just throw, what library that happened in. So that's like a 1d10. And then it goes up from there. Like everything is always d10s, which I think is quite a nice number, I think.
Yeah, and rounds off with the really, really delightful tumbling into a vortex of fire on the elemental plane of fire. Yes. It's like, okay, great. That's wonderful. 24 d10 damage. Oh, yeah, like being submerged in lava, something like that. Like, ugh.
Yeah, being crushed in the jaws of a godlike creature or a moon-sized monster. You're like, oh, yeah, of course, the moon-sized monster, which no one's talked about.
The moon-sized. I'm surprised it even does damage. Like a moon-sized monster surely would just kill someone. But
yeah, outright. Yeah, but I guess, again, it's that sort of thing. Is that people like rolling dice, so we've got to give it to them, I guess. But yeah, so there's that. And what I quite like from this is what it talks about damage severity and level. So it gives you that idea. It's like, okay, if you've got a lower level party, like what sort of damage do you think will just wipe out the party completely? And usually when it's a lower level from like 1 to 4, it's 4d10, which obviously to me is like, that seems very low. But then I got wiped out by a crocodile, so it all comes back to stuff.
Yeah, exactly. Deadly doesn't necessarily mean it has to kill, but it has the capability to kill in a bad situation. That's kind of what they're going for there. Like, as I say, like level 4, if you're a wizard, you've probably got along the lines of maybe 23, 24 hit points. So 4d10 easily can wipe you out in one go. But if you're a barbarian, you could have 50 hit points. So you'd be absolutely fine.
It's just a scratch. That sort of
it's
action.
It's just a flesh wound. It's fine.
Go on, hit me.
But you're right. It's a lot of this. It's all about improvising and using theatre of the mind, and there are all kinds of rules you can use if you've got maps and if you are using miniatures and counting things that way. But there are some really interesting things here about if you're using theatre of the mind and you don't necessarily have a map, you're trying to describe what's going on with just using words and averages and things like that. I mean, the area of effect sort of thing is quite interesting.
Yeah, so in the area of effect, it just says sort of, you take the sort of the size of the effect itself. So like take the example of a cone, you have the size and then you divide by 10. So when you do a cone or anything like that, you get the size of the cone, you divide it by 10, and that on average is how many creatures are caught in the cone. If you're like, oh God, I've put them around the map at some point, let's just try it like that. And you always round up as well. So you don't like catch half a creature in a cone or anything like that. So that's pretty good. And it is a nice way, because again, all these things are areas of effect. You got cone, cube, cylinder. What things are a cylinder? Is that like moonbeam and stuff? Or is that
something that comes down from the sky in like a sort of, like a shower sort of thing.
Oh, I never realized that. I guess I always assumed line and cylinder were the same thing. But I guess cylinder you can just put on the side.
Yeah, they very much are. I think the difference between is that a line is sort of from whatever point you're casting it out in a direction of your choosing. So you could use a line directly up, but a cylinder specifically is like a spotlight from above. Like it has an area of the floor, but it captures like a sphere, but then it goes directly up. So everything above it also gets caught as well.
Again, it describes this in a much more detail in the player's handbook, and they actually have diagrams and stuff, but it does feel that was meant really for wargaming and maps as well, so that you can actually measure out the squares or anything like that. So when you're doing theatre of the mind stuff, it can be a little bit confusing, or you're like, oh god, how many people do I capture in? So having something like this, where like it says, it gives the example of burning hands towards a group of orcs. It goes, well, it's 15 feet divided by 10, that's 1.5. Round that up, you catch 2 orcs in that, which I think is actually quite fair. Like it's not like you're not going to catch any of them, but at the same time, you're not going to catch 5 or 6, which might seem overpowered as such. So it's quite a nice way of easily doing that from a DM's point of view. Again, it's something that players probably would just be like, I do this, and you go, okay, and then you do the quick math on that. So yeah, I think it's a really nice little table, which again, I hadn't really considered before. I just assumed that I assumed, Ryan, because you're so great, you just pick, it's going to be 3 orcs at the same time.
It's all about using common sense, I think, isn't it? Like there's different averages you can use. There's different, if you know that some things are in a certain area and you've described it in a certain way. I mean, you like to reward players for using a bit of creativity and common sense and logic. So if they put something on the table that seems really sensible, then you know what? You might as well go for it.
The line of sensibility there, I've definitely done some players going, oh, I don't know how I'd rule this. I'll see what Ryan says.
Exactly. But it's all about theatre of the mind and using your brain to fill in the blanks effectively, to make it seem as real as you can. Because if you've got a map, then you've got miniatures, you've got actual spatial awareness of what's happening. But with theatre of the mind, to be fair, if anything, it lets you get away with more rather than less, because you are not constrained by very specific geometry and direction, and you can kind of describe it and maybe get away with a little bit more by saying, if I push that a little bit further, if I do this or that, then it just seems to be better. I think people can rely on maps too much. Some encounters do work very well with theatre of the mind. And I think some classes and spells work better with maps and some work with theatre of the mind. But yeah, using a bit of difference and a bit of variety in what you do, I think is you're going to get good results, and there's something here. Now, one thing we've had quite a few times in encounters of our campaigns and one-shots and things are mobs and large amounts of enemies who will sort of appear from nowhere, and suddenly you've got 30 little goblins on you rather than one huge dragon. And I know from experience, but if you've got 30 attacks coming in, it's a lot of dice rolling, and there's a lot of like, oh, for God's sake, right, here we go. And there's some really good rules on how to deal with mobs on this, actually.
Yeah, so again, it's like you said, like, in order to keep things going, you want to make sure, like, there's going to be some hits somewhere, but I guess it depends on, like you said, how many is it? Is it going to be 30? Well, then that's, like I said, it's a lot of rolling, and if they're using flanking, or if they've got advantage in some other way, like pack tactics, that's another one. It's like, oh god, what, has a lot of dice rolling, a lot of numbers. I think you've done it before when you've definitely had, I think up to 8, I think you've rolled like dice for, and then anything in double digits you've gone no, which I think is completely fair. But so in this one, it gives the example of how do you handle it. So it says instead of rolling an attack, determine the minimum d20 roll that would hit, and then do sort of an average on that. So it gives the example of 8 orcs are surrounding a fighter. If the fighter's AC is 19 and it's a +5 to hit, the minimum that they're going to roll is a 14, and you just work it out from there. Like it says here is like there's a table that's called mob attack, and it talks about like what is the d20 roll you need. Okay, attackers needed for it 1 to hit, and here it says 3. So out of every 3 orcs, 1 will hit. And so it's a quite nice way. Then you can sort of build it up from there. Say, okay, I've got 6 orcs, 2 of them will hit, 9, 3 of them will hit, and so on and so forth. So, and it's just very helpful, because then it just cuts down all that admin, all that worry about stuff. Because obviously the players themselves, they only really roll a couple of times in their turn, whereas you may be rolling many times, especially if you've got legendary actions, if you've got environment and stuff. So it just cuts down all that, and working out like how much health people have, if there's anything else coming. It just I think handling mobs, again, it depends on the encounter as well. Is it, what kind of mob is it? And the other thing that comes up a little bit later, it talks about morale. So if you've got say a group of bandits, who spring a surprise attack on you, but then it doesn't go their way. Your players kill the bandit leader, or they just don't land a hit on any of the players at all. It's like, okay, are they going to keep fighting? Are they just going to run and leave? And I thought that was good. It has a whole list of what people will do. Yeah, so it says minor characters might flee if they're surprised, because obviously it's like, oh God, what is this? And especially if they're looking armored to the teeth as well. If they're reduced to half its hit points for the first time in battle, because obviously suddenly you've taken a big hit and you're like, oh God, I could actually die. No harm is given to the other side. The leader is dead or taken prisoner. The group is reduced to half its original side with no losses on the other side, all that sort of thing. And then if there's no other route available to them, if they can't, they'll try and flee through like the quickest route possible. If they can't do that, then they'll just surrender. And I think that's interesting because a lot of the times, certainly early on when I played D&D, a lot of the times you're just fighting through swaths of enemies, and like they cut them down, it's all great. But then again, it just feels like a video game. Like, yeah, of course, they're not necessarily going to flee because they're programmed not to. Whereas these minor characters, these enemies, are real people. You have to treat them as such, and that they have their own flaws, they have their own feelings. So if they do run away, it's then up to the players to be like, okay, we're going to follow them and kill them, which I think that adds real sort of moral thing on top of that as well. It's like, they're running away. Do you stab people in the back like that? Yeah.
And it gives it, again, more flavor. It's all about building a story and making people immersed in what you're saying and what's going on. And as you say, avoiding that sort of RPG hack and slash pitfall that is like, oh, you attack, you kill, blah, 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 blah. If the enemies have a moral compass or a sense of fear or morale, as you say, then it can be interesting because, you're faced with decisions, and decisions are good, especially when those decisions are a bit grey as well.
Yeah. And especially nowadays when you have the two sort of different ways to gain experience. Obviously, beforehand, it'd be like every time you've killed something, that's a bit of experience. So you would go around farming up stuff. And again, that's the same in a video game. Whereas now, obviously, it's like, okay, you get points for missions and, oh, wow, you found this extra thing. That's a few more points. And then you can have, like what we do is story milestones where essentially like, hey, you reached this point, have some XP or level up or have some extra cool things for your skills. You're now proficient in X, Y, Z. So there are other ways to go about this, not necessarily killing everything in sight, which actually, I guess it just has weird tones for me. Is like, well, I don't necessarily want to kill everything unless I have to, because
unless they're going to come back and kill me later, in which case, life is forfeit. But there's all kinds of different ways you can rule it, and I think this is what the Dungeon Master's Guide is really good at. It kind of sets up, here's how you play the game, and then after that point goes, and here's how you can change it and tweak it if it needs to be faster, slower, harder, easier, whatever it is. And last episode, we were talking about magic items and the rules about how you want to change how magic items work. And I think, especially with the ones with average damage and with, as you say, mob attacks and handling mobs, there's some stuff here that you can use to basically create any encounter you want. I mean, I remember when we had an encounter with a pirate ship where there was lots and lots of ranged attacks coming in from one deck of the ship to the other. And I remember thinking at the time, like, well, if there's 30 crossbow bolts from very, very low skilled archers coming over onto a boat, how would you even rule that? Do you have to work out, 30 attacks, 10 go on this person, 5 go on this person, blah, blah. And in the end, I just used a deck save effectively. So if you were on the deck, you took a deck save and you took some damage. But I guess the good thing about this average attack sort of mechanism is that if you've got a really high AC, you're likely to really survive very well. And if you don't have a high AC and you stick your head out, you're likely to get hit. So that gives a kind of like a feel of who's squishy and who's not. And
when we look at monster manual guides as well, like it says like, okay, you could roll this amount for a bite attack or something, or you could take average damage. And whilst that you're like, oh, but it's fun to be able to roll and go, oh, they rolled really high and stuff. I think that completely depends on how many creatures you've got. If you're if you've got 8 hobgoblins and 3 of them hit, then maybe you would roll. But if you were like rolling for everyone, and then it's just the amount of rolling adds like at least a minute of time. So you roll, you work out, you hit, here's the damage, roll again, and it just adds a lot of time. If you're that sort of person who loves rolling dice, that's great. You realize that every roll extends the combat by a little bit more. And if someone's not into combat as well, because obviously some players don't like combat at all, they prefer social encounters and want to talk their way out of situations, you might lose them, or they might not not be interested. And then it comes to their turn and they've not been paying attention because of all these different dice rolls. So I think average, I think a lot of people like sniff at it. I think it's great. I think it's nice to have a number just to throw at people and then they go, oh God, that's a lot of damage. And you're like, yeah.
Especially if you're a DM and you're trying to do a really, really big encounter and an attack does 18d4, you think, you know what? I'm going to use average damage. I think that's probably quicker.
Definitely.
Absolutely. So when you were going through, because there's a loads of different topics here, when you were going through, is there anything that grabbed you as something you really like the look of, like something you would attempt to use?
So a little bit later on, it talks about obviously different actions that players can do, which aren't necessarily, I hit the thing, I run away from the thing, I dodge the thing. I even think dodge, everyone forgets about at times. It's only when you see another minor character goes, takes the dodge action, you go, that's super smart. And then you get hit by whatever it is. But it talks about some other action options you could do for combat, and you can be added as a group or an individual, and they are sort of climbing onto a bigger creature, disarming it, marking it, overrun, shove aside, and tumble are sort of the main ones for that. And I think these are interesting because, again, I don't know whether this is just me as a player, because I've always, again, the way I was taught D&D in quotation marks, that like I only knew of those sort of three things, like you move, you hit, you flee, you dodge. All those were the main things. But some players are like, well, I want to be able to get on the troll like Legolas does in Lord of the Rings. And you go, yeah, you can do that. Or I want to hit a particular point on this monster. And whilst a DM, you're like, well, that doesn't make a difference. But I guess it's maybe slightly harder to hit, or yeah, you can mark it and then you have advantage against the attack. It doesn't necessarily do anything to that particular point. You might not be able to blind the creature or wound its like arm, hand, or anything like that. But for flavor, that's a pretty cool thing to do. So yeah, so like I said, there's like this disarm, which is you make an attack roll, and it's basically a contested sort of strength or dexterity check, so if they can hang on to their weapon, essentially, which is quite powerful, because obviously if you disarm them, suddenly they're going to have to spend a little bit of time picking up their weapon. You could try kick it away, I guess. Or all they might have is like either a spell, which is probably quite dangerous if you're in close range of someone, or punching them with an unarmed strike, which is not necessarily very strong either. So that, I think that was a quite cool one, which it comes up in other RPG games. Certainly Call of Cthulhu talks about disarming someone, because usually it's about guns or knives or something like that. And it's not in a fantasy setting. Obviously it can be set 1920s or modern day, where it's unlikely you're going to have a weapon on you unless it's concealed, I guess. Which again, so I just thought disarming, it makes sense in a fantasy setting. Like, you know, as a hero, you want to disarm a creature before it surrenders, perhaps.
And these are all options that I've seen with, there's a type of fighter, is it a martial expert or something, with superiority dice, where you can disarm people on attacks and things. So it kind of throws some of those rules in. Yeah, I always like giving people the option to do things instead of just attacking, but these are some really good ones, actually. I think the disarm, as you say, is really fun. You could come up with all kinds of fun things you could do with that one. And overrun comes up quite a lot, actually, if you want to just push someone out of the way, being able to just sort of shove them out of the side. Is there anything in these chapters that you thought, I don't think I'd do that, there's like this maybe needs a bit of work, or not quite a fan of this?
It's nice to see like, oh, these are options as well. But again, there's a lot of, I guess there's a lot more checks and stuff. So like, it makes sense. Like if you're climbing onto a bigger creature, you're going to have to make a check to climb up and hold on. Those make sense, I guess. But like, I guess the shove aside one, the attacker has disadvantage on its strength check when it does so, when you shove. I was just like, I mean, I don't know. I guess because you have shove attacks, obviously, and stuff like that. I feel some of these, like, when are you ever going to use tumble? Unless you're a very small creature that just goes through someone's legs and just to run outside of them, I guess. I think some of these may be more flavorful. That if you, I don't know, I guess because I feel like these are checks that you just do. Yeah, just do a dex check, and it's not contested. Perhaps that's the thing. I feel like if you're a DM, the less rolling you do, the better for this. Because if they're like, I want to do this, you go, okay, you make the check for it. I'm not going to roll anything for it. And I'm just going to set a DC of like 15 or something like that, or 10, rather than you rolling it, because you could roll really poorly. And then suddenly your big giant has, I don't know, 3 halflings on it. And it's just like, oh God, this is painful. I feel like I would get rid of contested checks. I would just say the player has to do it and it has to hit a certain DC depending on how difficult I find it. And you can just go like it's 10, 15, 20, 25, etc. rather than you having to roll stuff. But otherwise, I think it's nice to have these options. And going back to the initiatives as well, I feel like, I have no intention of ever running the speed factor anytime soon without probably agreeing it with all the players and say, we're just going to test it and see what it's like. And then see what other people think about it afterwards. Because I don't think it's anything you'd use for a long-term campaign at all.
Totally agree. Yeah. It's I think it's just, I would want to give it a try to see what worked and what didn't work. But I could just imagine some of them would just be absolutely ridiculous to try and use.
It's about having confidence, I think, with it as well. I wouldn't do this with new players because I think that would really warp their version of like how to play, and it can be it's overwhelming in general. I think when you first start out because you're like, oh god, I don't know what to do any of these things, and then you go, okay, you got to roll this and you need to know what your spells do and all these things, and I think it would put off people quite quickly. But I think if you've had a couple of years running campaigns, well, I wonder if I don't want to say a bog standard player, but any sort of normal player who's not necessarily run D&D maybe wouldn't want to do this. Whereas from a DM point of view, like, oh, this would be quite interesting to see how it plays out. I think DMs are always more curious to try things and go, God, that was awful. We'll put that away for another time and not worry about it. So
yeah, exactly. That is a great segue because, I mean, all of these rules are great opportunities to let a DM really try something different, to try and change the game. So what I was going to talk about next time, actually, was options DM can use to change the game in its entirety, to really change the way that D&D runs, to change how people run it. And we're going to be looking at some chapter 9. So in the Dungeon Masters Workshop, there are all kinds of sort of rules that sort of feed onto the combat rules you were talking. But in terms of more running a game, thinking about hero points, ability scores such as honor and sanity, bringing in fear and horror into a game if you wanted to play something more Cthulhu-like, and even talking about advanced or futuristic technology and how you would bring that into a game as well. So just stuff that really might change a game in its entirety. The other thing we can talk about as well, which I find hilarious because I just love the idea about this, is something called plot points, which is where you can actually get the players to change how the game is being run mid-game, which is something that is both horrifying and fantastic.
That does sound terribly anxiety-inducing. You must have had that at certain points in our campaign where you've gone, oh, fuck, and then you've got a week to sort it out. So
yeah, exactly. We're going to end the week at this point, and we'll pick this up next time, and that's all great. In the meantime, before we have that episode, what are you up to? Where can we find you?
Where can we find me? So my name is Fiona. I run the What Am I Rolling podcast, twice monthly RPG one-shot podcast. As always, going really well. I'm also
always going well.
Always going well. RPGs. I'm doing more improv stuff, which is always fun. I've been on something called Revenge of the Werewolf a few times, which has actually been quite good. We talked about it a couple of weeks ago about playing characters different genders to you. I've gone in the last couple of times playing a male character, and I've done I've done a drag beard, like one of those proper 5 o'clock shadows. I tell you, our mutual friend Sam, who designed the logo to this podcast, usually I hang out with him before I go on stream. So I ask him how the makeup looks, and you can imagine Sam's reaction to anything that I wear is interesting enough as it is. He goes, oh, well, that's nice. Yeah. He gets freaked out when I put on the drag beard. It is hilarious.
Oh, that's amazing. Oh, yeah. No, I've seen a couple of bits and pieces you've been doing, actually, and it does look like a good laugh.
It is fun. It is fun.
Keeps everybody out of trouble. Hey, and you can find me on YouTube. I'm still on YouTube. I'm always on YouTube.
What?
Come find me. Plug. So Ryan, I've got a Discord as well. Come and chat to me. Say hello. And until next time, take care, stay inside, and see you next time.
Bye.
Bye.
Remain indoors. I love it.
Remain indoors. Don't talk about the event.
The event.